The university is no longer just in crisis, it's actively collapsing. Skole IRL is a podcast dedicated to understanding the worlds people are building in its ruins already today. Each week, we explore the emerging experimental sphere of para-academia, with thinkers and builders doing the work to create spaces for communal study and knowledge-making alongside and outside the conventional university ecosystem. I'm your host, Sarah Begovac.
And I'm your co-host, Ira Allen. Together, we're learning each week how to salvage Skole from institutional hoarding and collapse alike.
Join us in reclaiming time and space for something like leisurely thinking outside instrumental ends. Skole in real life. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skole IRL, where we explore how people are making space for collective thinking and shared knowledge. A huge part of that is looking at how these spaces can be more open and accessible to everyone. Our guests this week from Open Humanities Press are doing exactly that by opening up the world of scholarly research through open access publishing. Open access is a means of taking advantage of the global reach and relative inexpense of internet publishing to make peer-reviewed scholarly materials freely available. Open access articles go through normal refereeing and editorial processes and are thus fully academically certified. The difference is that open access publications can be read and downloaded for free from any computer anywhere in the world. This week, we are joined with Sigi Jöttkandt, Joanna Zylinska, and Gary Hall, the directors of the Open Humanities Press, an international community of scholars, editors, and readers with a focus on critical and cultural theory and a mission to make leading works of contemporary critical thought available worldwide. OHP has operated as an independent initiative since 2006, promoting open access scholarship in journals, books, and exploring new forms of scholarly communication. OHP's organization is a community interest company headquartered in London. The OHP Editorial Board is at the heart of all of their activities, participating in journal assessments, reviewing and approving book series proposals, performing and managing peer review, and editing the OHP book series. They act on the principles of access, scholarship, diversity, and transparency. They've also partnered with a number of groups and institutions to explore grassroots solutions to the crisis in humanities publishing. Sigi Jöttkandt is an associate professor in English at UNSW. She's the author of The Nabokov Effect, Reading in the Endgame, First Love, A Phenomenology of the One, and Acting Beautifully, Henry James and the Ethical Aesthetic. With Prue Gibson, she edits the Seed book series at Open Humanities Press. She is also editor-in-chief of the open access journal, S-Journal of the Circle for Lacanian Ideology Critique. Joanna Zylinska is a writer, lecturer, artist, curator, and according to the ImageNet Roulette's algorithm, a mediatrix. She is professor of media philosophy and critical digital practice at King's College London, the author of a number of books on arts, philosophy, and technology, including The End of Man, A Feminist Counter-Apocalypse, AI Art, and The Perception Machine. She's also involved in more experimental and collaborative publishing projects, such as photomediations. Her own art practice engages with different kinds of image-based media. Gary Hall is a critical theorist and media philosopher working in the areas of digital culture, politics, and technology. He is professor of media at Coventry University, UK, and was founding co-director of the Center for Post-Digital Cultures from 2017 to 2025. He is the author of a number of books, including Defund Culture, Mask Media, A Stubborn Fury, Pirate Philosophy, and the Uberification of the University. Let's get it started right here with Open Humanities Press. Hello, Sigi, Gary, and Joanna. Thanks so much for joining us today. Let's just jump right in. What is the Open Humanities Press? How did it come into being? And what conditions are making it both possible and necessary?
Who wants to go first?
One thing to say, I suppose, is sometimes, because we're very familiar with all this history and things, if we're saying something that, we're talking in a shorthand or that doesn't come across as clear, just please feel free to interrupt us or ask us to unpack something or like that. But we've been doing this a while and we know each other very well now, so we might skip over some of the necessary details. Sigi, do you want to start with the history, or would you like me to start with it? Or
I'm happy to start, Gary. So OHP has, I guess, a number of different origins. The official story is that Gary and Joanna and I met at a conference that I organised in Ghent in Belgium in 2005. And we started talking about open access. And out of those discussions, maybe I should tell the other part of the story too, which is that David Otina at that time was embarking on a project to grow furniture in vats. And in order to do so, he was...
so quickly.
What's that?
I should answer quickly. Seconds.
Okay, so it's a longer story, the vat-grown furniture. But out of that was the realization that the sciences had been very active in making research freely available online. So open access was well established in the sciences. You had ArchiveX, you had Cielo, PLOS had just launched. And so this larger discussion about why humanities were not also making their work freely available in open access. So that was the larger backdrop to our conversations at the conference, which then led to our famed White Horse Talks, which was a conversation that Gary, David and I had in Portsmouth at a following conference the next year, where we were thinking about how we might activate some of the conversations that we'd had at that earlier conference. So initially we thought we might launch a journal, try to establish a very high-profile journal in critical theory. But then we thought, well, why stop there? Why not launch a press? So that was the origin story of OHP, coming out of this realization that the humanities were lagging far behind in open access compared to the sciences. And yet, even just a cursory look at the online space in humanities is that there were already a lot of really good open access journals that were sitting, in these remote parts of the internet, not really connected with each other except for, their own overlapping communities. And we thought we'd begin by bringing these journals together under a single press heading, and that really launched the project. So we started with 5 journals: Fiber Culture, Culture Machine, Cosmos and History, Vectors, and Film Philosophy. And they were the original first OHP journals that we launched as the opening gambit for OHP. Very quickly, sorry to just keep talking, if this is okay, Gary and Joanna. Very quickly after we launched, we got a lot of attention from the academic presses. Not university presses, but I'm thinking of things like Chronicle of Higher Education. They interviewed us. Times Higher Ed also did a feature on us. And there was a lot of activity in the online space saying that this is really a needed project, but that journals are not really the main problem for humanities. It's really a question of monographs. So, this is where humanities scholars, cut their teeth, as you know. This is what we do. We need a book in order to get our first job. All of the institutional structures that flow through from these publication requirements. So at that moment, we made some outreach to libraries in the US who were also doing interesting things with open access, and that brought us into contact with Maria Bonn and John Wilkins at the University of Michigan Library. And Maria in particular had been spearheading a subgroup inside the library called the Scholarly Publishing Office. And this was a really visionary project that she spearheaded, because the fundamental commitment to publishing was that the library would put publishing resources, make them available to scholars, but not just to University of Michigan scholars. And that's what made it possible, I think, for them to create this new ecosystem that scholars like us, projects like Open Humanities Press, could then participate and partner with them. And so then we were able to launch the Monographs project, again with, did we start, I think, with a couple of, maybe it was 5 book series that that then enabled us to develop in tandem with libraries how open access book publishing might be envisaged and how it might work in practice. And so there was a lot of really valuable experience that came out of those collaborations. After Maria and John left for the University of Illinois Library, the new head, there was a kind of a reconsideration of the various projects at the library, and so the Scholarly Publishing Office was rethought as part of the University of Michigan Press, and that at that moment we felt it was we were ready to go independent, to part ways, and that was when we consolidated and organised ourselves as a community interest project in the UK. And I'm just going to stop there because I feel like I've said everything that I need to say. I've done my part now.
As I remember it, we did discuss starting a journal originally, but we kind of thought, this is just to put an additional layer on that. We kind of thought, because I've been doing Coach Machine since 1999. And we one of the issues was, you can start another journal, but they still don't have the status, the kind of kudos as the print versions. So our idea was to get the journals together in a kind of a more community or as a collective. And the idea being they'd have more strength as a group than they would just like isolated individual journals, which turned out to be the case, really. And then, Sigi put it in a very gentle way. I kind of remember people kind of challenging us. It's like, yeah, but you can't do it for books, kind of thing. And so maybe I just respond better to the challenge. But I remember a bit more like, it's okay because of the different licensing agreements and copyrights around academic journals. It was easy academic articles. It's easy to publish them. Open access, but books was always seen as harder. And then, the presses, the conventional presses, put so much work into doing their books that how could we actually do the equivalent of that? So they were just basically we were told that it'll never work for books. So we were so
we gave up and went away. So actually, in the interim, so we've been running OHP now for 20 years, and I think we're close to having published 100 books since those first. We're up there.
Yes, so we met in 1995.
2005.
Is it?
Oh, I think it was 2005.
Yeah. 2005. I've got the wrong century. So 2005. We started in 2006. The journals launched in 2008, and then the books in 2009. Yes. Okay.
You were probably the first press in history to launch with the plan initially to print furniture.
Very visionary, you see.
I wish he was here and I could tease him about being a cross between Frankenstein and IKEA, but it's
he's still working on it, Gary, believe me.
No, he's got a vat somewhere with a table. It's just kind of
yes. But this is exactly the spirit of Open Humanities, because I think the idea was, and I was always involved in kind of some side projects around Open Humanities Press, but I only became a formal part, if there is such a thing as a formal structure, quite recently. But I've been involved in Culture Machine as reviews editor, and then but also with some projects around Open Humanities for many years. I've been editing a series for Open Humanities for many years and been involved with a group, but they kind of allowed me to play with them. But I think what we all shared for a long time was the spirit of just trying to go. I don't want to sound like I'm from Silicon Valley, so I don't want to say go and break things, but we literally kind of would go and break things within the university, things that we didn't like, that we found annoying. So in a way, I think the three of us were lucky because we've had jobs, we've had academic careers within the period when at first it was still an attractive career and it was nourishing intellectually, but there were always things that all of us were not happy about. To do already with questions of power, the structuration of knowledge. We all come from all sorts of peripheries in terms of, class, nationality, background, all sorts of forms of belonging and non-belonging. And I think we all had a certain sense of that things could be done otherwise. There's other ways of producing knowledge. Who is authorized to tell us what to read, how to read? Who has the right to read philosophy, to publish philosophy? Who tells it? Is it the authorities, people in the position of power, the old elites? So the choice was, as Gary always can put in his kind of previous book, was this relationship between the liberal and the neoliberal university. And we were not happy with either. The liberal university, because it was, old guys, usually from Oxbridge when it was the UK, telling you how things should look without really getting too much, and especially into continental philosophy or critical theory, which was anathema to those guys, or neoliberal university, which, still is with us and we are with it or around it or against it or whatever position we take, is kind of devouring more and more of us. So I think that's been the spirit as well of trying to navigate. Again, I don't want to sound like Anthony Giddens or another kind of third-way politician. So we were not trying to do a third way, but we were trying to find an alternative path. That sounds a bit more Heideggerian. That's not a good reference either. So, yeah, I'm sort of like all the kind of academic references, as we've discovered through the project of critical thinking and writing, they all carry traces that we are not happy with. So we are kind of working our way through academia, which is still part of us, and that to which we still have some weird affective attachment. Some of it is probably love combined with all sorts of other emotions, obviously anger, disappointment, frustration. It's all there. And that translates into our relationship to the body of knowledge, critical theory, continental philosophy, which has been what's driven, and media theory and art, this whole nexus of stuff that Open Humanities has been involved with. So as well as kind of working on the way of publishing things and making it available, it's also been the driving spirit has been an attempt to forge a kind of pathway through the thicket of ideas and institutions that have facilitated critical theory and the humanities more broadly, but also that have been constraining as well as enabling for different groups within and outside academia.
I'm just saying it seems to be relating to the space where you're coming from with this podcast, because if you don't want to be just simply in the dominant form of the university, but now that you just want to be outside as some sort of entrepreneur, or these days people will be influencers and things, how can you navigate a space that's different from both of those? And it's not that we would say that we're completely inside or completely outside, or maybe the inside outside doesn't work for us, but it's kind of, how can you create spaces for doing something different? For us, how can we create it for ourselves? How can we create it for other people? What can other people do that we can kind of learn from and share and things like that?
Yeah, and this meshes really well with actually our next question in some ways, because it's striking listening to you that I don't think I quite realized this, that the project really began in this collaboration with one of academia's most inside outside spaces, which is librarians, right? I mean, like we often don't think of libraries as spaces of radical invention, and yet librarians regularly think of themselves as people who foster radical invention. And I'm curious then how you, as you've grown past the origin space as an organization, how you've maintained this sort of sense of scholarly community across vast physical and political spaces, how you sort of both establish for newcomers, and this maybe speaks a little bit to what you're saying as well, Joanna, like newcomers to the group, but also maintain for yourselves across 2 decades. That's a really long-running collaboration, this sense of community that is, properly speaking, scholarly and yet not cleanly located within the institutions. What does that look like? What does that mean for you?
Shall I start again?
Go for it.
Thank you.
Please.
It's interesting because of the way that OHP has grown. It's been this organic process where, we start with one or two projects, and then they move into other sort of areas, and then people come to us and they have their own project. And so it's been this kind of snowballing really, that, we think of OHP as having many, many different kind of locations and spaces where people are just sort of working on things that they want to work on, but that, OHP becomes part of them rather than them becoming part of us. So it has this, and when a lot of the people who are involved in the book series, they also know each other and go to conferences together, have, ongoing collaborations with each other. So there is the sense of multiple networks that are kind of spread out that OHP is part of or one of, but they also have different connections with each other as well. So it's kind of, I guess you could say, a sort of a rhizomatic structure.
In the libraries, where the librarians came in, particularly in the early days. I mean, you've got to remember this is, open access was in a very different place. It was more unusual to be talking about it, especially in the humanities. It was much more of a sciences thing. It was again because the contracts that academics would sign and publish under with journals were much more. It was much more amenable to publishing and making preprints available. But the librarians were radicalized by the costs of what the traditional presses, Elsevier and Co. were actually doing. They were actually seeing, so they were far more radical about it and up in arms about it than your kind of average academic who just didn't see any of those costs. And so they knew it and they were feeling it. And so it's not kind of surprising that we started with the librarians. Yeah, the community is. I guess one way of, the phrase that my colleague Janneke Adema kind of coined, which is like scaling small. But, we've been kind of working this for a long time, as in we don't want to take over the world. And our ambition is not to grow, add more book series and journals and just get bigger and bigger. And so we make everything open access in our kind of way. But that's not where we're at, really. I mean, we make where it's appropriate, we make our work available open access, we make it open source. But the idea is that people, wherever they are, can take as much or as little of it as they want, and they can build their own organizations, their own entities. It could be presses, it could be journals, it could be something else. They can learn from us through the Copying Project. We've kind of made a whole load of documentation about how you do this and the licensing, the whole structures, and it's just for anyone to take. And then, so we don't want to kind of roll out our model, which is kind of, in this era of, being very sensitive of what's happening in the global south and decolonization and the epistemologies in the global north and global south. I mean, that just doesn't sit with us ethically or politically. So we just make our stuff available, and then people will go and do it. If they want to talk to us, if they want advice, if they want support, then obviously we offer that. If they just want to ignore us and not, that's okay as well. That's entirely up to them. We try and publish. It's much easier than it was in the early days. We try and publish in different languages as much as we can. It would have to be, mainly Spanish, French, but that's still hard. No matter how much the translation has got better, the technological tools for that's still very difficult. But there are other places that can publish in those languages as well. So we kind of, we do co-publish and work with.
And just on that note, so we publish under Creative Commons share-like licenses for the most part. And what that enables is for modifications, like translations, to be undertaken without express permission if the subsequent modification is also then published under the same license of share-alike. So, and just to add to those languages that Gary mentioned, we've also, I think there's been Turkish translations and also Russian translations that have come out under this Creative Commons share-alike licensing.
We've also been experimenting with licenses. Gary always is difficult and goes and makes up his own licenses for anything he does. So he writes his own because he thinks that Creative Commons is far too conservative for him. So these are some of the fun conversations we are having. It's like the world, you have to convince all your academic colleagues that, Creative Commons is a good thing. And yet there comes Gary who says, no, this is like really, we need something much more extreme. We need to rewrite the words with which we write the license. So that's kind of, but the idea around, as Sigi said, that Open Humanities Press is like a rhizome. So obviously we've been publishing a lot of the theorists who were thinking in these kind of horizontal ways, and we're developing theories of horizontality, theories of political power, which was much more capillary or distributed. I don't know, take a Foucault or Deleuze, and or kind of feminist theory or theories of the global South. We're also looking at kind of pluriverses. So all of this was happening. We were trying to think, okay, so what happens if we are trying to understand some of this in the structure, the organization of the Open Humanities Press, so which is also dislocated. And so the directorship has always been like plural in a way. It's always been like 3 directors, and it was Gary, Sigi, and David for a long time. And then I replaced David at some point. But there have been other people who've been working with the collective. Series editors have been very important. Their series are their kind of spaces to grow and develop and do things. There have been lots of peripheral projects that were not necessarily books, but other things with other colleagues coming and working. And another important thing is conveying that spirit of collaboration to others when encouraging them to come and join the project. So, for a long time, academia has been fascinated in the humanities with this concept of care. And I think some of us, myself included, are kind of quite ambiguous about care. Not because I, do not care. It's because I'm kind of concerned about what underpins that desire, that call for care. What kind of unspoken forms of violence, forms of unacknowledged kind of transference are present in that articulation. So, but at the same time, when writing about care, which is a kind of big thing at the moment, and rightly so, amongst the scholarly community in the humanities, we've also tried to introduce the actual practice of care into our ways of working, while also demanding care of others. So, for example, I've been running a book series called Media Art right now, and presenting, people send proposals. Sometimes people know what Open Humanities is. Sometimes somebody tells them it's just this open press. They don't charge author processing charges, send them something. And very quickly, I've got like a little compact that I tell people, well, this is what we do, this is what we publish, this is the idea, and this is how we behave, and this is how you should behave as well. So it is prescriptive in that way. So saying it is a community of care, but we will look after you and do labor. But because a lot of the labor, not all labor, a lot of the labor is voluntary in the sense that people who are salaried and, as you would say, tenured in the US, can afford to give a little bit of their labor towards what they see as a just cause, for which they don't receive direct remuneration. There are other forms of payment that we use, of course, especially to, like some royalties and paying some people for production if we can. But there is that kind of form of transfer, but also behaviorally, we are not just a service for scholars. If you come and join us and publish a book with us, there are certain things that we expect. Don't just come and dump things on us. Don't just come and behave the way in that kind of service economy model. Take responsibility for the means of production and for the practices of the production of the book and what it actually means. Most people are really very willing to come on board and to understand that. But I think the first gesture of actually telling people, this is it, this is how we do it, and this is what you should do, this is what you're signing up for, I think sometimes it starts a very interesting conversation that people are active agents, but also they're accountable to us for how they treat us, and not just necessarily, they need to be nice to us, although they do need to be nice to us, but also in terms of respecting the shared project. And that is a sense of, telling people community is also a responsibility. So some of this, so we don't have like one big group of 1 million people that we all kind of come online and sing, from the same hymn sheet, but it's much more about developing lots of loose threads, people becoming connected through different forms of belonging and participation, while also becoming activated through seeing that this is a meaningful project, which is not also done by this group in an inside group, but everyone has to do their bit, but also through this they become part of it. So well, I make this sound like a cult now. God.
No, it sounds like a union, like a good union.
Not quite as formal as that, but the idea is if we're going to change, even if we just stick with the basic open access, if we're going to move to kind of open access, it can't be just people like us that are going to do it for everybody, and everyone else can just carry on acting the same, and they just give us the stuff, and us and other presses or entities will deliver that for you. Everyone's got to change the way that they operate. It doesn't mean that they've got to turn themselves into presses, but they just, like Joanna says, we're not a service. We can't just take that and take that work and labour for you, the whole of it. You've got to work with us. It's about working. Yeah, I mean, even when we're talking about the global south and things, it's that shift from it's that shift of knowing with and working with. You kind of got to work with us a bit.
Just to expand on that and the systems of care and the idea of belonging and collaboration in the spirit of that, can you talk to us about some very concrete practices or projects or collaborations that the Open Humanities Press is involved in, that they feel like they produce alternative ways of being, of thinking, of learning together that are outside of the academic form? I know we talk about this idea of like inside, outside. So what are these different projects or collaborations that you're going on that produce new ways of being or studying or thinking together?
Well, we established this subgroup of Open Humanities, which was the Labs project, which was intended as a space for, more experimental approaches to what thinking is, what publishing is, what writing is. There were a number of projects that came out of that both Gary and Joanna were involved with.
Well, Gary, maybe you could talk about the living liquid books and things, then I'll talk about the art things. And
okay. Are we thinking they were out? But the question was about the outside of the university. Are they outside the university? Yeah, we're going to cast them as outside the university. Well, we'll kind of talk about it. So, the idea of that is, and we're doing it, the more recent series of the combinatorial books, Gathering Flowers series that I'm doing with some colleagues as well. That's the more recent version. But the idea is, open access. Especially when we started, it was just about a few things. It was about making access to texts more open and accessible, and maybe playing with copyright around Creative Commons. But there's a whole load of other features of publishing, and even publishing with a Creative Commons license that they can work on, that you can play with, that you can change. So one of the ideas was paper books. They're not entirely fixed, but they're reasonably fixed over a certain amount of time. You produce them on paper, and they're kind of there. And more copies are kind of, they're not all exactly the same, but the differences are very minimal. But if you're moving to the digital form, well, text don't have to be like that. So what we wanted to do is produce some series of books using wikis that people could put together as a community, so it wouldn't be just a single author. They could, as well as producing them, other people could come in and edit them and rewrite them and rework them, and they could fork them and do their own versions of them. So, if you needed a version of this to a particular text to teach with, you could come and take one of them, but adapt it and add the text that you thought were particularly suitable for your class, for your location. It wasn't meant that these texts were going to be universally appropriate for everyone. So the idea was to kind of to play with that and just to experiment and push with that, just to challenge a few things. Yeah, like I say, it was more collaborative, communal writing. Texts were no longer fixed. They were never finished. They were just much more open and fluid. So we wanted to play with all those kind of things. And then that opened them up to not just academics. I mean, I think the series, I can't remember how many people there were. I think there was about from 60 different countries. And so they're open not just to academics, they're open to journalists and kind of other researchers and anybody that wants them. Really.
School kids, secondary school students. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did a book sprint in Mexico at there was a festival for which I was artistic director called Biomediations. It was a huge festival with a kind of I think 20 or 30,000 people participation. And as part of that, Gary and I ran a book sprint, and it was a live editing session. We edited this living book. So the concept, the whole festival was about biomediations, living objects, living media, and we tried to show this idea of a living book to people. So we gathered a group of people, and we showed them earlier versions of living books and liquid books that we've done as part of our Open Humanities projects. And we, with a group together, we've put together such a living book on biomediations, which then continued to live online, and others could come and play and do. And these gestures often function kind of symbolically. So it's to say that people are actually very wary of doing anything to the book, The most they can do is underline things in a pencil with their book. We kind of encourage people, come and rewrite stuff, do things, go crazy. And there is still a lot of distance towards any form of experimentation like that. The authority of the book is huge in our kind of Western, the culture of the book. So those experiments, a lot of people commented on them, how important they were. People were happy to play in very specific playgrounds that we've created, but any encouragement to go and really kind of be radical and tear things apart often was met with resistance. That was very interesting to us as well, that we almost needed to facilitate the play and be like kind of kindergarten teachers saying, okay, here's okay, let's burn down some books. No, we're not burning them down, but we are digitally burning them down and then rebuilding them, word by word. So that was okay. But encouraging people to think about, what is a book? Who is the author? All the things that we were reading in texts like by Barthes or Derrida or Foucault and others, saying, okay, let's try and think with this and see it happen and make it happen. That was always like, oh, no, that, we're not going to do that. So that kind of encouragement, but also maybe making people comfortable and pushing some scholars in the humanities who are very well versed in the letters of the book, literally and metaphorically, to get them to open the book up a bit more to the point that it falls apart, was also part of our kind of strategy and desire to see what happens if we actually dare to do that.
And that kind of relates to some things we might talk about in the future, about where things are going, because it kind of, we did that books in Mexico in 3 hours. So we just put one together in 3 hours. But yes, if you just write about it and make a book, like Joanna says, we've all read out Barthes now, Foucault, but everyone still goes, oh no, I can't touch this. But if you're actually in the room with them and you've taken them through it, then somehow you can give people permission and they will do it. So maybe some things we might want to do, as well as all the other stuff in the future, is do things that are a bit more less online, more offline, more local, more kind of personal. Maybe we have to do some of those things in the future. It's just some
yes, because you are into people again, into meeting real humans. That's Gary's going through a new phase.
Really, like, I'm not into people.
Yeah, because young people, we've discovered, young people are really like doing these meetups and book clubs and just face to face. So that's, obviously a lot of the things we've done have been digital, and even like pre-pandemic, and it's been a great kind of, thanks to digital technology, we've been able to do that. And even now, we're obviously meeting for some of us at crazy times because we are all in different parts of the globe. But at the same time, there seems to be a desire as well for people to kind of gather in small groups and do things around books, ideas, philosophies, knowledge, also outside university, to do things in that kind of, so to open up a lot of different things, including institutions. But I wanted to add another thing, if I may, since about experiments and how we do things outside academia and other communities. So for quite a long time, I've been between two sets of institutions, academic and artistic ones. And obviously, they both come with their legacies. They both can be very conservative, very oppressive, but there is also space in both of them to play. And artists are given permission to play. So I've always, when working within the art world, I've been borrowing ideas from academia and trying to be less reverent and kind of playing with knowledges, with ways of showing things not just in the white cube. When being in academia, I've been trying to bring ideas from the art world. But within the kind of Open Humanities Press, the Media Art Right Now series has allowed me as well to continue with those experiments of opening up the book and to try to encourage projects that take art writing seriously, while also treating other media, including the medium of the book, as seriously as the content of which we are writing. So for that series, a lot of people who are publishing are thinkers makers, So even going beyond that idea of the artists, they are thinkers, makers, people who, think conceptually in a variety of different registers. Not all of them need to be trained through a credentialized system of a PhD. Obviously, there is lots of, very smart people thinking in interesting ways coming out of alternative trajectories. And there is definitely space for that in many series, including mine, but also people producing knowledge, not just art, but producing knowledge in different forms. So we've had filmmakers who've also produced, films as part of the book. Maybe they're coming out of the book, but because we already assume the book is open anyway and falls apart, so that's okay, and we can do it digitally. We've had people, who've experimented with the book being a performance, artists like Mark America and Laura Kim. We've had people working with kind of performance spaces, alternative performance spaces in London, and doing kind of like fungi media around different ways of being with others and being a performer, while also performing, sexuality through the book in a different way. So that sense of opening up what it means to publish, to be a writer, has also been part of the experiment, and bringing in other communities and say some of them with an artistic spirit, even though they are not all necessarily kind of classified as professional artists, if there is such a thing.
And just to loop back to defend myself from liking or not liking people, what Joanna is referring to is I'm working with a collective of young people, definitely in their 20s, maybe some are in their 30s, called Everyone is a Girl. And what I'm interested in related to your original question, and again, kind of where this podcast is coming from, is people who maybe haven't found a space in the university or don't want to find a space in the university, don't find it a very hospitable space, a welcoming space. That's, even if you can get a job, it's still, you've got to abide by certain conventions and rules. People are not always very happy about that. And it's, it's precarious. It's not always a caring profession. It can be quite aggressive and hostile to some people. So they don't want to work in a university, but, and they maybe have jobs outside of it, but they still want to be creative or artistic, as Joanna's talking about, or they still want to do something. So this seems to be, a particular, I don't know if I'd call them a generation, but it's a kind of an age group anyway who are trying to do things. They were trying to do something, and we're not going to use the word like a third space or something like that, but they're still trying to do some interesting things. They've been through higher education. They know their theory, but they're trying to do it. Some of them are theoretical, some of them are making films, others are making music, poetry. They're doing kind of performances. And I'm I'm interested in that. And I think kind of where you're coming from, I'm kind of wondering what we can do to help people survive in this space, because we've used the university and we give them time to do research, and we've chosen to use some of that time to do a project like Open Humanities Press. But what if you don't want to do that or can't do that anymore? I mean, it's harder. It's harder for early career scholars now. I mean, one of the things we might talk about is who's following on, who's doing similar things after us, and why does it sometimes feel to us that maybe not much is happening in that space. There might be lots of reasons for that. But if people still want to do it, but they just, how can we make it financially supportable? And this is where this podcast is coming from, isn't it? It's like, how can you survive? And if you don't want to then turn into some sort of influencer or entrepreneur where you're going to go on Substack and something and sell subscriptions and do all of that, and you kind of turn into the business person, and you're hustling all the time, and you're kind of trying to get your stuff out there and hits, and that's draining as well. Can we find some different spaces where people can still be creating, but in some sort of different way? And that's kind of what I'd like to for us to explore a little bit in the future and see. I mean, it's typical of us. It's not a small question, is it? Can we come up with a new economic model? But it might be interesting to explore. And people are doing this, and they're doing it for a certain time, because when you're a certain age, you can afford to do that. You have the energy to do it. You don't necessarily own your own living space. You might not have settled down. You might, all these things you can kind of do in your 20s and early 30s that you can't do in your kind of mid to late 40s and 50s. It's kind of different. But is there something we can do? Because otherwise, the kind of culture and things we're interested in is getting squeezed out, isn't it? I mean, what's happening in America, and what's interesting about Trump is he's very blatant about it. He's very hostile to Harvard, to Columbia. They're just they're the poster boys, if you like, but it's very hostile to the kind of work that we do. In Britain, it's less overtly hostile, but it's still happening. I mean, more and more academics in the arts and humanities are losing their jobs, and their departments are being closed, and it's getting harder to do the kind of critical work we do, which now gets badged as critical Marxism and critical race studies and all those kind of woke things and it's nice to be such a threat. I mean, for years they used to kind of ignore us and just say, God, there's the corner of the bookshop that was just too complicated to read. It's great that they now see us as being so dangerous, but it's still having an impact.
It seems to me that part of what you all make or do with the press is about permission structures, just listening to you. And it seems like part of what I'm hearing is that the work of the press essentially creates or installs or negotiates new permission structures for what we here on the pod think about in terms of Scole, in terms of something like kind of a collective and leisured even, and yet also productive negotiation of traditionary and more than traditionary texts and ideas. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how does Scole, scholarship, often very conservative words, and yet I think some of what we want to conserve, even in our more radical impulses. What do these mean to you? And how do you, or do you, hold space for that specific concept in the press's work?
Yeah, I'm glad that you picked up that idea about permission, Ira, which Gary was also talking about. I mean, one of the founding gestures of OHP is essentially you don't need to ask permission. I come out of a Lacanian background, and the phrase would be there is no other of the other. There's nothing there that is really dictating what we can do, what the possibilities are, except our ability to be energized and to find creative workarounds for where there are blocks. So one thing that OHP decided very early on was that we were not going to apply for grants. So we were not going to enter into that round of applications and denials and applications. And then if one does finally get a grant, then one is beholden to the terms of the grant. And then, everything seems to shut down. And then the desire stops being for the work itself or for the thinking of the project, but becomes part of the, meeting the requirements of the granting body. So yeah, for me, I guess scholarship has to do with that ability to have the academic freedom to pursue thought wherever thought wants to go, and to do it in a way that is as unconstrained as possible by existing structures.
Yeah, I mean, in our various communities, other organisations, entities do it kind of differently. So, people in scholar-led do it differently. The people in the Radical Open Access Collective, they're all exploring. If we're going to kind of change things, and we're going to not solve the problem is too final a thing, but if we're going to change the way that scholarship works, the way that academia works, we've got to have lots of different experiments and just, and see what works and see what doesn't. And so other people, they are applying for grants, they are employing people because they feel that that's the way that they can do the production and that they can produce the texts, and that's fine. We are very worried about it. I mean, we have got one or two smaller grants for particular projects, but by and large we kind of prefer not to, because then you just end up managing the grant rather than actually doing the work, and it's not partly probably where we're at a lot of the time. But if you're employing people, you've got a responsibility to them. So you're getting a grant and you employ people, and then you're thinking about the next one and the next one, and it becomes about maintaining the business. And we wanted to be led by different criteria from that.
I'm just going to say really quickly for some of our US listeners who are not as familiar with how much UK and European academia in general tends to be, even in the humanities, fundamentally oriented by and organized by grants. A lot of a lot of US listeners are not going to have that necessarily automatically in mind. So what you all are describing as creating a permission structure outside of that larger institutional world of funding structures is, especially in that context, fairly radical, to take on a major institutional project that's not tied at its core to some kind of grant funding is a fairly extraordinary endeavor, even more so in the UK or Europe more broadly.
But it also allows the press to be like untethered to any particular university. So it's like Sigi said, Open Humanities Press is a community interest company. It's an UK legal term for a company that is not for profit, and that its goal is to, any profit that is generated has to be put back into the company for the benefit of the community. And obviously we have to declare who our community is, and the community is for Open Humanities Press are all those who would be interested in humanities ideas, not just academics, but also those outside. We have to do, as well as our annual and financial statements, which are, all public through, we also have to write a report on our annual activities. So there is accountability to what we do, but that sense of kind of working within that other form, other kind of legal structure, which is like in a way independent. That's always been important, I think, to David, Sigi, and Gary from the word go. Even though you worked with institutions like Michigan for a long time, the fact that it is its own entity now, and it allows a little bit more freedom as well, and maybe we've given ourselves permission as well for some of the crazier experiments as well. So, we are accountable, for what we do within the press and within its kind of structures, but it's saying like, this kind of stays with us here. And academics now more and more often have on their profiles, ideas are my own, not those of my employer, on their social media. So, but we've also managed, as well as kind of creating other spaces, we've managed to, we kind of very low on social media use, between low and non-existent. We also, and that's thanks to David Otina, who's been very, keeping us on the very righteous path, but we are not, and Sigi as well, that we are not, we don't track users, we don't use any of the Google tools, we don't know who downloads our books. People can keep asking us, don't you want to know? And in some sense, the logic that you have to datify everything, in a way, where does this come from? So suddenly we found out, we've always operated this way. David and Sigi have been very adamant that this is the way this should work. And we think all agree that this is a great way to do it. But suddenly we've become radical again, because of the increasing datafication of all aspects of our lives, including academic lives, and have we to account how many times people have downloaded your article, how many times you've done that. And again, that starts an interesting conversation about scholarship. What counts as good scholarships? How many times your book on Lacan have been downloaded? What does this data point tell you actually about the value of your scholarship? So we are still, and I don't want to sound like a humanist, although I am a humanities scholar, but it creates another set of values for conversations about culture, and that kind of conversations that we can have with our authors or prospective authors. Some of them might find what we're doing too radical in that way, but also because we are untethered in a way, then we don't have to have some of the tools. Sometimes there is different organizations who do that. Again, we often collaborate, and I think Gary and Sigi have a long experience of collaborating with other presses in a horizontal way. We've co-published a book with Maison Press, for example. Other presses might have other structures, so it's also non-rivalrous. And it's because we don't want to be the biggest or the most famous, so that those collaborations are important. But that sense of that we don't have to do certain things because we are not accountable to that kind of numerical, datafied culture of the present day is something quite important and perhaps, increasingly unique.
Yeah.
It's probably important that we don't make this sound like this was kind of easy, or we might have given ourselves permission. One of the great things about working with Joanna and David and and Sigi and others on the project is it does kind of shore you up a little bit when you have moments of doubts. Like there's somebody else out there that kind of thinks similarly, but it's not easy. It's not easy doing this, and we probably have all made sacrifices. We haven't had the kind of smooth careers that we might have if we'd have. I always had a fantasy that I'd just have been a Dickens scholar. It would have been much easier. I could have just done Dickens. He's dead. He's not going to write anything else. There's enough to kind of work in. It's a finite field. It's okay. I could just do it. Be all right. Once you'd kind of mastered it, it would be all right. But, we haven't done that. We've kind of, it's been what we wanted to do and it's been important to us. But, there's pros and cons of that. There's been sacrifices. There's been difficult points, when you're talking about the liquid books, when I first suggested doing those projects, I couldn't get other people at my particular institution interested. They just looked at me and, what on earth is that? That's just ridiculous. That's just stupid. We're not interested. Obviously, 5 years down the line, they're all thinking, oh yeah, maybe we can do this. Maybe we can have a liquid book and things. And you kind of go, okay, fine. Well, this is how you do it. Go away and do it now. But, and that's, again, giving people permission, goes back to that. It's like showing them how it's possible and things. But people, for various reasons, don't want to do what we've done it the way we've done it. And it's okay. It's fine. People don't have to. For some reason, it's been important for us, probably for each of us of having our different reasons. But, it's been great, and we probably wouldn't have done anything different. But I don't want anybody listening to this thinking, yeah, it's all right for them. It's been kind of smooth sailing, and look where they are now and things. It hasn't. God, we can tell you stories about early open access conferences we went to, and the finger wagging and the kind of all sorts of stuff that went on. And as you might have guessed, we're not good with authority. So when we were turning up and there was all these people from these funding agencies and things, and just who are these upstarts, and now they think they're going to do books and stuff, it was not a happy fit, I think. So it hasn't been easy. It hasn't been without its challenges. We can laugh about it now.
No, that seems like a really important thing for people to hear, is on the one hand, it hasn't been easy, and correspondingly, it is something that you have collectively done all the same. Like, I think that's something people often fall into, a kind of a trap of, like, either it must be fairly easy or you just don't do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that combination of the solidaristic attitude of shoring one another up through some slings and arrows along the way is quite important for people to have in mind if they want to make something new, that's part of what that entails.
But for all the reasons we talked about, and we talked about, Trump, and it's got particularly a political or ideological take, but going back to your thing about the grants, I mean, that's another way that the humanities are being squeezed out and controlled, because particularly in England, there's more and more pressure on people to get grants. It's, because, the government decides which areas it wants to fund, that goes down to the funding agencies, that goes down to the universities. So someone else is deciding what the proper areas are to do. And if you're told by your institution, well, you have to earn your salary, you have to earn your keep, as a humanities person, that's not kind of easy. And then, you're having to do what the funders or the government is telling you what the right agenda are, which is, in the minute it's all AI and health and all those kind of things, and you've got to switch your research to that. The point about open access, and we started off with the fighting against the publishers. Publishers wanted to be able to sell their books. So if you had to tailor your research to something that they could sell, ideally to first years, because they're the ones that buy the books in the big numbers until they realise they don't have to do that anymore. So you was always having to kind of tailor. You couldn't do the kind of cutting edge research, or not overtly, the kind of really rigorous and more difficult things, because that wouldn't sell. And so you're always having to meet the market. And it's even narrow now. You're having to meet the market of where the funding is. And there's not much funding in humanities. The government's,
So if you were doing Dickens, Gary, you wouldn't be in any better place now. You would have to do Dickens and AI.
But I'd do some sort of I do some sort of autobiography, it would be me and Dickens, wouldn't it? I'd be kind of, 10 objects in Dickens that teaches us the world, or I'd kind of stroll around Dickens London and kind of, and I'd do a podcast and I'd take people on a walking tour. I could do all this if I wanted to. You think I'm just not doing it because I can't do anything else.
To any readers, you do actually like Dickens. We don't want to use Dickens as this kind of,
I'm a well-rounded person, and I like a lot of different authors. Dickens would be one of them. I don't want to come across as in Dickens or obsessive. I just picked him as someone that was, it could have been anyone.
We'll have no Dickens hate on this podcast.
It could have been George Eliot, or we don't want to get into Middlemarch.
No, let's not go into Middlemarch. Then we'll have to a competition, and people have to admit whether they've read Middlemarch or not. And, it's not as obvious with English scholars these days anymore.
I think the word is finished rather than read.
Read, okay.
But anyway.
It's like Netflix. If you've watched the first 2 minutes, it counts as having seen the film in their notice, apparently. Yes.
Yeah, if you've read the first 2 minutes of Middlemarch, that counts. See, there's good things about this new digital way of doing things.
I was thinking about in creating new sites of possibility and the hardships that come with that. And it can be really easy to get caught up in those hardships and not imagine new possibilities or not imagine new ways of thinking or being or what it means to write or what it means to publish. So I'm curious how you imagine the future of scholarly publishing. Again, this tension between and beyond the university. And are there any spaces that you take inspiration from or any that you maybe hold as cautionary tale? What is important to you in your envisionment of future publishing?
Now we've gone quiet.
Yeah. Well, let's also say you all, in some ways, have been paving a pathway towards a future, and we are asking you to make predictions now. And nobody likes to make predictions, except for the people who like to do so very much, too much. But we really do want to invite prediction. Where is it all going? What happens now?
Science fiction writer Stanisław Lem, whose Summa Technologia translated a while ago, once said that if anyone wants to think about the future, they should write this down and put it in the drawer and then take it out 5 or 10 years later and we'll all laugh. So, but anyway, in this spirit, I think maybe the future of scholarly publishing is in other media. And maybe, I've been experimenting with this concept of kind of the end of reading, and it sent, some of my colleagues apoplectic. Even though, quietly everyone is complaining about, students read less, academics read less, and nobody has any time. So I've been experimenting as a philosophical project with this idea. What would happen if we stop reading as a species? Reading, we humans haven't always read. And, reading or the book is only one of the media through which knowledge is transmitted. We could obviously all moan and write books like, Nicholas Carr and all of these, The Shallows, our brains are getting stupider, our phones are getting smarter, it's all very going to their dogs and all very bad. But I'm wondering, could we have a non-hysterical response through it? And could Open Humanities Press stay within that space of, turn towards other media, return to other media, be it like more visual media? And I'm not trying to be simplistic and say, you used to have books and Derrida and things, and now we have TikTok, and maybe that's amazing. Maybe it is amazing. Maybe it isn't. The point I'm making is, I think, slightly bigger, that taking that spirit of curiosity that I've learned from a number of scholars, continental thinkers, critical theorists around the media, which make us and which we make, I'm wondering whether we could respond to the current moment, including AI, with some kind of curiosity as well as, right caution. And what would it be to experiment with that moment of changing media through which, things are happening? So maybe the future of publishing is in a very expanded definition of publishing, because obviously podcast gets published, other forms of maybe, what would happen if what's happening with the current language models. And we're involved in a small experiment with Erasmus University in Rotterdam around language models, as well as a discussion consultation with the whole of our community of readers and authors, thinking about what to do, again, rather than just panic or saying no to AI, because that moment is gone. We can't, it's too late to just now decide we'll say no to AI. So thinking about that sense of, What will happen? What forms will it take? So again, we're still keen to experiment, to see, but also myself, at least, I'm entertaining the possibility that maybe there will be other media, and maybe that will be okay. Even though I myself, as you can see behind me, I'm very fond of the traditional and relatively bound object of the book. That's been my path. But maybe, perhaps, that's the path for other people, other generations coming after me. Maybe they'll have a different sort of consoles behind them, made out of different things, and less visible ones.
I guess, well, we have described our project, but I realise that other people might describe it differently. Is, if we're moving out of that Gutenberg world of the printed book and we're moving into some post-Gutenberg, post-print universe that we really don't know what it's going to look like, what we're doing is experimenting with that. We're experimenting with what those possibilities. We haven't got the answer, but it's like, okay, what can you do with these different media forms and things? So, to play your game and answer that, well, one of the reasons why perhaps other earlier career scholars these days aren't starting presses in the way that we did, and a lot of people that were around at the time and came afterwards kind of did it. Maybe books is not just where it's at for them. Maybe they're kind of much more into, social media. Those platforms are all right. John has talked about us not being comfortable with a lot of these platforms. Earlier career scholars generation don't have that problem. They've just grown up with it. What's the problem with Instagram or YouTube or any of those things? It's just not an issue for them. But, even that, some would say that people are moving out of that. Now that it's all being flooded with AI slop and things like that, there's all the stuff about dead zero. People are, the term posting zero. People are just sick of being bombarded with adverts or people telling you about their personal lives, and all influencers advertising things. So they're not even posting anymore on these platforms and, giving you the photographs of them on holiday and things like that. So people are moving to other forms. Some of them are moving to podcasts. Some of them are using newsletters. A lot of it is short form videos. And there's a whole range of, people doing interesting things around videos. But when we were talking before, maybe people are doing something that it's a bit more local. They're doing things that are offline. So they're doing zines, or they're doing book clubs, or they're doing kind of live events and where there's kind of performances. And some of those we might get into. We did some podcasts about 10 years ago when podcasting wasn't popular because, we're really good at, hitting the zeitgeist and surfing the wave. And then, obviously we gave it up, and then COVID happened and it all kind of hit. But, maybe it wasn't for us. We've done video essays. We did video essays probably over 10 years ago. And that's kind of good, and it's all right. It's interesting. But we kind of moved on and done some different things. So it's all experimenting with these new forms and what we do. We give permission. We're kind of prototyping some of these things. Some projects for us, we want to stick with a long time, which is what Open Humanities Press has been. Other things, they just have a limited lifespan for us, either because we're working with people for a certain amount of time, or just, that's as long as our interest works. And then you kind of hand it over and let other people get on with it.
I think for me, I'm still seeing the value in the book, the printed book. And I have a different experience from what Gary and Joanna are talking about. I go to conferences. I was just in Ljubljana last year, and there were some people from Brown University who had heard of OHP and were coming to me saying that they wanted to do something similar. Could I help? What kind of resources could I offer? And so I pointed them to the materials that the Copen project had put together. And I was just at a para-academic festival in Melbourne just in early December last year. And it was the same thing. There was the Small Press Repress, which even predates Open Humanities Press as really the very first open access press in the humanities. Paul Ashton and Justin Clemens set it up even before OHP, and Paul was actually one of the original founders, helping us, learn about the processes of publishing books. They have just published a remarkable book by George Vassiliopoulos, who is an Australian Greek philosopher. He works on Hegel, but it's a very idiosyncratic Hegel. He's really sort of pushing forward the question of what it means to be an Australian, as part of a settler colonial population in relation to the local people, and really thinking very rigorously through what this question of accounting for oneself is, and how Australian, non-local Australians have this responsibility to account for ourselves fundamentally to the local population. And this is a book that's published open access, and it's also published in tandem with a series of poems that he wrote as well, called Ash Poems, and another book that's it's called A Genocide Alphabet. And so I guess I'm bringing this in just really to say that the book form still seems to be a really important form for people to work through ideas at a very rigorous and very slow and systematic kind of way, a very philosophical kind of way, that I think that the book still, lends itself as a structure and as a form to doing. So I guess that's just another sort of perspective on the question.
That loops back to the question of what scholarship is for us. I mean, is that finding spaces for that kind of rigorous? It's not for us about, as you've seen, it's not about being hits or popular, or we wanted to experiment with podcasts because we thought everyone would like it. It's because you're kind of working through some particular ideas. But yeah, the book is still really important for us to do that. University is still important for us to do that. And they're not the only spaces you can do outside university. Art is another way you can do it in particular ways. But it's to keep that kind of that rigor that Sigi's referring to, that kind of, and as we've been talking about, society sometimes it feels like there's fewer and fewer spaces where you can do the difficult stuff. I mean, I was joking about, they used to have this stuff in bookshops. Well, you don't get this, a cultural studies section anymore. You don't get, philosophy sections anymore. The most you get is like smart thinking these days, isn't it? Particularly in England anyway. So you might find some stuff in bookshops attached to art galleries, but it's
mainly scarves and bracelets. So well, it is, yeah.
Just thinking of how many scarves and bracelets I've got now.
Guys, I would like also to have it on record that I do like books, just to make sure. And also make sure that, Sigi, I do like books, I really do.
You did. You've got a big shelf behind you. We know that.
I do, but, I just don't. Sigi has seen them in real as well. So
I just remember this is an oral thing. It's not visual.
It's not a wallpaper.
Yes, big shelf with lots of books on it behind you.
Just to build off of loving books, are there any thinkers or scholars right now? I know Sigi mentioned one that you think our listeners should be reading to right now, and why?
Well, I might just add that we've just published a book by Tom Cohen, Ecocide and Inscription, Volume 1, Black Ops, which I think is, again, sort of returning to that question of, where is scholarship going in the future? How do we think that our relationship to language and to literature under the conditions of climate change? I would very much recommend the listeners to have a look at what Tom is doing. It's a series of readings of Faulkner, Toni Morrison, Hitchcock, and a number of films as well. And it's really just pushing what literary studies can do under these absolutely unique conditions that we find ourselves in 2026. What about Gary and Joanna?
Joanna had a whole list.
You had a whole list?
No, I didn't have a list. I was thinking, we were talking about this earlier. And so one of the things that we've always been kind of excited about doing with Culture Machine, as well as going beyond the traditional kind of Western canon of thinkers and readers, and reaching out, seeking knowledge in other spaces. And kind of, again, one of the positive things about kind of global media is that people know that knowledge can come from different places. And for a long time in academia, knowledge could come from other spaces. You could get thinkers like, Manuel Castells, like you could get thinkers like Gayatri Spivak, but they had to be validated by Anglo-American universities. Once they got the stamp of approval and they become Anglo-Americanized, they were kind of legit, and then they became like ours in a way. So I'm kind of, but obviously there are certain conditions had to be fulfilled intellectually and also in terms of a certain intellectual glamour, I suppose, for that work to land, which also meant there was a lot of other perhaps interesting, perhaps less showy work that didn't land. So I suppose for me, the idea, and also because I've always, I'm Polish originally, although I've lived in the UK for a good part of my life. I live my life in 3 languages, and well, mainly English and Polish, but also I've got working Spanish. So that sense of knowledge happening in other spaces. So maybe it seems like a trivial thing to say, but looking for those places of knowledge, books, forms of writing, literature, and some kind of somewhere between literary and non-literary genre that can't yet be classified as belonging to any kind of knowledge production genre in a conventional sense, maybe outside the Anglo-American nexus. I mean, I think that would be that would be my recommendation, and that's why I wouldn't give names. It's more like an exhortation for people: go and seek out other knowledges, other forms of producing knowledge. And of course, there is limitations what people can do, because if a work gets translated, also is the question who doesn't get translated, who does, how does it happen? But just to kind of maybe go beyond the obvious and see that kind of intellectual serendipity, which is what we've tried on a small scale. We tried to curate with Open Humanities anyway, and it's not like a replacement. Obviously, we still operate with great respect as well. I was trained quite canonically within the humanities, English and philosophy, and I've got a great respect towards that tradition. I still read Plato, so there is that sense of knowing where you come from and recognizing that tradition, but also seeking out other forms of knowledge, other ways of knowledge making that are, and it could be, for some people it's tarot, for other people it could be, I don't know, Native American or Latin American thinkers, or thinkers coming from outside the dominant kind of, structures of knowledge.
So, I mean, to see what we're into, I mean, you just, look at Open Humanities Press. I mean, you see what we're doing and who we're publishing. So that's one kind of answer. Another way of answering this is a kind of a side project that I was involved with. It's called the Robot Review of Books, because it's very hard. I found out with Culture Machine, you kind of started off and you wanted to do book reviews of the books you were into and the people you really liked. It's very hard to get people to do book reviews these days. I mean, no one has the time. It doesn't count in the UK. It doesn't count for research assessment framework. Anywhere else, it doesn't really count, for promotion or your CV. So it's very hard to get people to do reviews. And you spent a lot of time so kind of involved in this kind of side project where we have AI avatars reviewing the books. So you can kind of go and have a look at that and see some of the books. I've got some of them here. So, pretentiousness, why it matters, which seems kind of quite appropriate, I often think. Adam Phillips, On Giving Up, which is also kind of quite tempting sometimes. And so you can kind of see some of the things we're kind of into and doing that. I don't know, I really wish I had. I mean, I probably has if I kind of really went into it and things. There's lots of things that I love. I also wonder, and I wanted to ask them, maybe if Sigi and Joanna agree or disagree. But, when we were kind of in graduate school or coming through, there was a whole kind of, canon or list of people who were really important. Even if you just start with Heidegger and you've got Levinas and Derrida and Foucault and Lacan and Deleuze, and then they get into Stiegler and Haraway and Hales and all those kind of things. It kind of stretches. But is there still those people in quite the same way? And some of them we probably publish, if there are. I mean, Timothy Morton and people like that, Isabel Stengers, we've still got publishing some. But are they still those kind of figures in that way? And should there be? I mean, if one of the things we're trying to do with Open Humanities Press is do something different from a legacy press, then should we also be thinking about something that, coming up with some notion of a theorist or a philosopher or a scholar or an academic that isn't a kind of a legacy form? Do we have to come up with a different way so there wouldn't be that continuing tradition? I mean, when I was growing up, everyone wanted to be in bands, and because they're guys, and everyone wanted to be the new Jimmy Page or the Richie Blackmore, and they always kind of wanted to be heroes. And you can see it's an affliction that strikes men a lot, I think. They all want to be the kind of the new Deleuze, the new Stiegler, the new Latour. They kind of want to be that. But is that what we need? Is that healthy? Is what we want like now? So I'm creating problems for, I suppose, for your question of like, should we still have those kind of those figures, those heroes, those people? And I've only can say this because I've read lots of these people and others like them, and I still love books, and I still love this kind of rigor. But I'm just kind of wondering. I'm wondering.
Well, that's a good note of indecision, uncertainty, refusal of projecting any one future, a world where many worlds are possible, for us to move towards closing on. And I wanted, before we do quite close, I wanted to ask, what have we not asked you about that if we understood better what you're up to and why, we might have. What else matters here that we're missing?
My God.
Okay, worlds. There's worlds more that matter that we're missing. But
I mean, other people, one of the things we don't talk about so much, and I'm kind of pleased about it, but if we were at an open access oriented conference, they'd be talking about the money. They'd be talking about the money a lot more. And, how do you get the money? You can't do this without the money. Why aren't people giving us the money to do this? Much more focused on that. And I completely understand that. I know where they're coming from, but I don't know. Should you have asked us that? Would we have been interested in talking about that? I don't know. But yeah, other people would have asked us more about the money, yeah.
So the other side, the flip side of this is, and I think why we've kind of carried on, and as well as obviously having, hopefully as a kind of smaller inner group, having strong ties of friendship and shared project, which we can still share around continents, and shared project being not just Open Humanities Press, but also what it stands for, all the things we've talked about, even though we might approach them differently. It's that we also care about ideas. And I suppose that's the important thing. So in a way, some of us might prefer if these ideas, continue coming in the form of books. Others might think, oh yeah, let them come in the form of beads, I don't know, or lollipops. But it's just that the sense of ideas and having also a trajectory, a historicity, the sense that they come from somewhere, they're going somewhere, having different geopolitical locations. And I suppose for me, especially kind of doing Open Humanities Press is allowing me to have this space where ideas matter and that I don't have to justify to anyone or explain why I'm doing such weird things. So that commitment to ideas and thinking that ideas matter, and you live, I don't want to call it living the life of the mind, because I'm not a 19th century English gentleman, thank God, but it's so ideas are something different. There is a critical spirit to that concept, and there is a certain irreverence as well. There's playfulness, but there is a rigor, and I think that that sense is probably what I would like to convey, that having spaces for ideas. And again, you could see how that line could be very easily monetized and used by some kind of new startup for ideas space in East London. But that anchored in that tradition of humanities scholarship, even if it's kind of rubbing against that tradition and trying to break through, I think it's something that matters to me a lot.
And I'm glad, Joanna, that you mentioned this question of friendship, because that's really at the heart of OHP, isn't it? I guess one question you could have asked us, Ira, would be, what keeps us going, or, how long is OHP going to, continue? And I mean, it continues. It's really on a day-by-day basis. We have no big business plan that, says that, when we reach X number of this or that, that we will have succeeded, or, it's always just in process. And I think what keeps that process going is this really fundamental sense of shared values that Gary, Joanna, David, and I have. And that's what really sustains us. Even as Gary says, sometimes it can be hard. Sometimes we get exhausted. But what's also lovely, I find, is the way that when one of us is exhausted, another one of us will pick things up. And there's just this sense of, joint responsibility towards each other as well as towards the project that does come out of the sense of shared values, friendship, and hate to say it, Joanna, but care. We do care for each other very much.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it's a gift as well. It's a gift to have been given that kind of community and to have a sense that there are these people there about whom I care as collaborators on the project, but first of all with fleshy humans with whom I spent many hours, and not just online but also physically in different jacuzzis of the world. And that's because that's how we roll at Open Humanities. No, we have been in jacuzzis together, really, and drinking bubbly and just enjoying ourselves. And that sense of care and friendship, and knowing that there are people, literally at the other end of the world, because obviously we are spatially quite distributed, who kind of know certain things. So you can sometimes mention things in an email in shorthand, that they will still understand the joke. We might not see each other because of the pandemic or distance for a few years, although we talk online obviously a lot. But, the people who get you and who get the sense that these things matter and that the project of what we all care about is bigger than the four of us, and yet that there is something binding that is specific to our conversations and, what's emerged between us, and also the unspoken, the affect, I think, is quite important. So anyway, I love you, Sigi.
I'm not going to say anything after that. I'll just anything from climax after that. Let's just leave that so I don't mess.
You don't do affect, Gary. No.
No, but it wouldn't be as beautiful as that. It's just,
No, I'm a lachrymose person.
Even with you, that was amazing. Yeah.
I teared. One can't see it, but I've teared listening to you do that. It's really a gift to hear your story about this as a story of people. It's a story of ideas, and it really grounds ideas in people, and not to be Aristotelian about it, but in friendship. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much, Sigi, Gary, Joanna. Really, this was great. And having this conversation around commitment to ideas, commitment to care, commitment to friendship, just continuing to salvage a sense of Skole and inventing something new in the world. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
It's been such a pleasure.
We should say that if anyone does want to get in touch and talk about any of this or starting something up or anything, we try and help and support as much as we can. So we're kind of available for that, within reasons with all the other things we have going on, but we try. So people would be welcome. Yeah.
And thank you for facilitating, to both of you, for facilitating that conversation and also even giving us this opportunity, which is like holding a mirror. And, sometimes it's nice because I think we do know we have something precious, but sometimes amongst all the bureaucracy and dealing with the books and authors and everything, sometimes it's very nice. So I've really appreciated that, and seeing ourselves reflecting on the, over 20 years of doing this. So that has been a gift as well. So thank you to both of you for hosting us.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.
A huge thank you once again to the Open Humanities Press team for joining us here today. It really is a gift to hear all about what they have created together. I feel like something that really stood out to me was just the level of care that they have, not only toward the idea of ideas, but toward each other as well. I feel like that really stood out to me. That level of affectivity, I felt like was really something that was important in considering what goes on into making a sense of knowledge, or what knowledge production looks like, is having a sense of overall care or affectivity toward that thing. And that can sometimes be overlooked, I think. I thought that was really special.
Yeah, I think like that, I totally agree. The sense that a lot of what we think of as scholarship or the institutional life of the humanities in academia has to go through these abstracting processes, these processes that make everything more and more impersonal and more susceptible of being rendered as data, which is like one of the things they were talking about that struck me. And that making a space for Skole outside of the university system, or in this like weird alliance with the university system, because that's kind of how I think about what they're doing, that making space for Skole in this weird alliance with the university system offers this maybe space for, but also requires a different kind of interpersonal care. And I was really struck by the way they talked about trying to model that, but also like really communicate the need for that to authors for the press, that like that sort of idea that there's a kind of social learning process for participating in Open Humanities Press. That to me was really interesting. It was another kind of wrinkle, because I feel like I'm really glad we're having this conversation, right? So we're and maybe we should step back out a second and say, so this is the 4th episode of 8 episodes in our first season, and we're kind of taking a moment to take stock of what we're doing or what we're finding, how we think these relate to each other. And so maybe it'd be interesting to think about that dimension of care as something that's kind of run through each of the 4 conversations we've had so far, even though our conversation today complicated care at the same time. They're like, well, no, but we don't want to be taken to be saying care as in service. We mean a different kind of care as friendship.
Yeah, I think so. And care as something that is, I don't want to say driving force, but something that is what it takes to do something like this. Because I think sometimes people are like, oh, I don't know, maybe like they're trying to like figure out like what makes sense for them in terms of like how they see themselves as a scholar. Maybe they have frustrations with current ways of structures around scholarship, and maybe that can feel a little bit hard to navigate. And knowing that something like care is something that can drive you forward is that what it takes to do something like this. Because that's what I think is at the heart of it. Someone is like, hey, I think this thing is really cool. I care about this thing. And you create that community of care for people to also be a participant in that, I think is really, I don't know, compelling for me, because I think sometimes it can be hard to get lost in like, I don't know, like the logistics of starting something like this, or like the, not red tape, but sometimes like different ways of like navigating institutional limits or logistics with that. It's like, no, like actually, like this is like a starting point, and this is kind of like what binds this together and keeps this going, is something that is part of that meaningful experience, and that level of care with that, I think, is important. And I've seen that like with, of course, Open Humanities Press, but the other ones we've been talking to so far as well. And I don't know, even like in us creating this, I feel like there's a level of care that we're attuned to.
Yeah, there's like this emerging discourse, or it's been around for a few years, but of critical care work, of like what we like, maybe some of what's best in what we do in the university is critical care work. It's not just sort of we don't just provide services for people, but we care in ways that are maybe reverential of one another's personhood, reverential of our text, but at the same time critical of one another and of our texts and our traditions, so that we're not just trapped. And there's something about that process of critical care that I like, part of what I hear you saying, and I agree strongly, is really at odds with like the like sole author entrepreneurship model of starting things, where you're like, you need to be highly agentic. We need a highly agentic person who is the founder, and then is the face of the thing. And like, even in this like Silicon Valley model of that, of course, actually it's always a giant collaborative effort. It is just like one big face, because that's like what makes that kind of funding model for venture capital more compelling, is to have some quote unquote highly agentic person as the face of a collaborative endeavor. And I think like what we've kind of heard throughout these conversations, and definitely I've experienced trying to do this pod with you, is this sense of whatever Scholé is, it's not really best realized through like some one person who's the face of it. It's really best realized as a kind of conversation that is suffused with care. So the Independent Philosophy Institute, or Exploring the Future Philosophy Institute folks, they're just regular philosophers having a conversation over some years about how to salvage something that they love. And they do different versions of it, but they feel themselves to participate in making something together in general, and they want to salvage space for that. And Bisser is this like giant amalgam of 20 gazillion different things, but that are all kind of united by that sense of care. And obviously Abolition School is fundamentally about finding ways to care for each other in the world that are also at the same time critical. I really like that. Yeah, I think you've hit on something central here.
I think it's a deeply humanizing practice, and I think it kind of goes back into like what it means to, I don't know, just be human together. And like we have these questions, and we have these like avenues we want to explore, and that's just part of like what it means to like be here. I don't know if I'm gonna take it to that level, but that's what I don't know, that's what it means to me. And like that's what, and like people are just like doing that. They're making space for people to do that at the end of the day, and like to, explore parts of themselves, explore like where their thinking wants to go, where maybe they didn't think their thinking could go together, and they're kind of centralizing around that, kind of like decentralizing from that in a sense, but also like centralizing around that, and different ways of forming new ways of belonging and unbelonging, I feel like, that are kind of, I don't know, deeply human in nature, that I think is important to hold on to as we, I don't know, sometimes spaces can feel like it kind of takes some like humanity out of it. So it's nice that that's kind of at the heart of it, I think.
I love that. I totally agree. And I think that really sets up the second half of the season really nicely too. Like, we're fundamentally trying to understand a meaning making process. Like, a
Yeah.
lot of times we think about scholé or scholarship or schooling as these maybe fundamentally institutional things, fundamentally abstracted things, but what I hear you saying, and I'm just repeating myself, but I totally agree. Like, I think is what we're hearing in all of this and experiencing in our conversations is much more like, well, what's really matters is conversation with real people about sort of a shared unresolved process of meaning making. That's about, we think through stuff because we're trying to make sense of what it's like to be somebody, and and that kind of unresolvedness drives the ongoing conversations that cash out as Scholé.
Yeah, and different ways of producing knowledge, I think, and different
Yeah.
ways of making, in the spirit of Open Humanities Press, making things open and accessible. I think that's at the heart of it for everyone. I think that the more and more we can do that, the better.
Heck yeah.
And tune in next week where we are joined with Dr. Aaron Manning and Brian Masami from 3Ecologies, an autonomous learning environment exploring collective techniques for creative thought and practice. Its activities are radically open, guided by an ethos of self-organization and open accessibility. We talk about this idea of emergent collectivity and how it reimagines the conditions for learning and thinking together, not as fixed structures, but as living processes. We talk about how such practices sustain intellectual life outside of traditional university ecosystems and how they invite scholars within and outside universities to inhabit new modes of shared study and becoming. Until then, for myself and Ira, thank you for listening.
Watching as the vortex spins below, you throw an insult to the volcano. Oh, my lord, is nothing sacred anymore. No.
Thank you to Devin Church for making music available from his album All That's Solid Melts into Air. For a link to Devin Church's music and other key resources on today's episode, check out our show notes.